What needs to change in OKC?
Well, before I even go there, by the way, Max, as we were talking, I forgot one coach to mention, Quinn Snyder in Utah. Outstanding job this year, deserves a lot of credit. Now let's get back to the Rockets, Thunder. Here's the deal. You're the Thunder. You got to get Russell Westbrook some shooters. You got to get him some dudes that can hit shots from the perimeter. You've got to have cats that he can kick the ball out to, and they can fire away. A Kyle Korver type, for example, needs to be somebody that they're looking for, somebody along those lines. I know to a lesser degree you have that in Doug McDermott, but there simply aren't enough scorers. Guys that can make open shots on Oklahoma City. That's your biggest problem. And if that doesn't work, Max, get a quintessential prototypical point guard who can run the show, but also has a perimeter shot, and move Russell Westbrook to the 2 if you have to. But you have got to get someone else who can score and take some pressure off of him, because Russell Westbrook doesn't even realize it, but at this rate, he's cutting his career short. I don't care how great he is. Nobody could last but so long carrying the load he's had to carry this year by
this is
himself.
not rocket science. It's exactly right. He needs a couple of shooters, whether it's a stretch 4 and a perimeter guy, but shooters who aren't just brought up off the bench to shoot, McDermott, guys who can play the game, who are good enough on both sides of the floor that you can leave them in for extended minutes in a starting rotation, hopefully, and can shoot. You know, the best real player you can find who can shoot, or rather the best shooter you can find who can approximate a real player. J.J. Redick could be available, and someone like that, a dead-eye, drop-dead shooter, and maybe a stretch guy. They brought in Ryan Anderson for James Harden in Houston, a Ryan Anderson type, doesn't have to shoot that well, who can also play some defense. Yes, obviously, that's what Westbrook needs. And if you give him that, that's an elite Western Conference team.
The Clippers host the Jazz in Game 5, their first-round series tonight. L.A. will have Austin Rivers back in the lineup after being out since late March with a hamstring injury. Max, if the Clippers lose this series, who's getting the blame?
Doc Rivers. Doc Rivers, the GM. Look, we all know Doc Rivers can coach. Although I do get the sense, Stephen A., that these guys don't play for each other. You know, I get the sense that sometimes these guys are miserable playing professional basketball in Los Angeles with great teammates wherever you look. And maybe that's on the coach, but we know based on his history that Doc Rivers deserves the benefit of the doubt as a coach. He's an elite NBA coach, and he got some criticism in that regard that I don't quite understand. As a GM, just hasn't done a good enough job, period. Hasn't done a good enough job. The bench is better than it was, but it's not outstanding. He rode this big 3-ish, if you consider DeAndre Jordan a part of that. You can. DeAndre's become an excellent player. Too long. And clearly they weren't good enough to get over the hump, and yet he stubbornly kept them together. And Doc the coach is talking Doc the GM into some bad things. Doc the GM gets the blame.
Well, I can't disagree with you with that, because he could have had Carmelo Anthony. Even though it wasn't his fault, I was hearing that one of the reasons they didn't make the move is because they wanted to hold on to Austin Rivers. You would think that Doc Rivers had everything to do with that. I heard there were other people within the organization that didn't want to get rid of Austin Rivers, and that's why Carmelo Anthony is not in a Los Angeles Clippers uniform. Having said all of that, where your point elevates in terms of potency, Max, is in this regard. Doc Rivers won 57 games his first year with the Clippers. Next year, 56. Next year, 53. This past year, 51. Trending in the wrong direction.
Know why, Stephen?
Not significantly, but nevertheless, it's happening. And so as we look at that, and we take into account that reality, we can't completely absolve Chris Paul either, because you're either a superstar or you're not. And I believe that Chris Paul is a superstar. Some culpability is aimed in his direction. Injury plague, injury bug, that has something to do with it. But ultimately, it comes down to Doc Rivers, the GM, simply because of the parts that are surrounding him, DeAndre Jordan and Chris Paul. You have got to be willing to let go of one of those three to get other parts, and that takes the GM. And Doc Rivers might be too loyal, Max, to be a GM. He ingratiates himself with guys. It's a
We
personal
talked about
relationship at
this
some
the other
point.
week.
He shows that level of faith.
Yep, we talked about this the other week, and I mentioned the Eagles. Why did Chip Kelly do well in that first season? Was that a Chip Kelly team or an Andy Reid team? Chip Kelly got his hands on it, made a Chip Kelly team. No more success, not on an NFL level. And you look at the team Doc Rivers inherited, that was Neil Olshey and staff's team. Olshey left, Doc Rivers took over, and every year you see the effect of Doc Rivers' GM. Because Vinny Del Negro is an NBA coach who hasn't distinguished himself as excellent compared to the others. Doc Rivers is. So I don't think it's Doc Rivers the coach. It's Doc Rivers the GM.
Max,
Well,
if you had or
couple
both
of
of you.
things.
Stephen A., go
Couple
ahead.
of
I was just going to ask you, if you had a magic wand, essentially, what would you do with this team?
Well, here's what I'm saying. First of all, Vinny Del Negro deserves a head coaching opportunity. He should be a head coach in this league. I saw him and Sam Mitchell on NBA TV the other night. Both of them, as far as I'm concerned, with some of the guys that we see getting opportunities, both of them should be head coaches in this league again. That's number one. Number two, when we think about Doc Rivers, again, Max, it comes back to what I said a bit earlier. Doc Rivers' strength as a coach may be his weakness as an executive, because even though he's demanding and he holds guys accountable, Doc Rivers is classy. It's easy for him to be personable and ingratiate himself with guys. He is a master at cultivating good relationships. As a result, he's also loyal. And because of that, he may be reluctant to let guys go when he actually needs to in order to make the team better.
It's a great
Blake
point.
Griffin
I loved
is
it
a
when I made
viable
it last
asset.
week.
What should they do with this team, Max?
They need to blow it up.
Really?
I mean, if they want to keep anyone,
I wouldn't say blow it up.
I'll tell you
Just
why.
get rid of one of them.
I'll tell you why.
Get rid of one
If
of
you
them.
want to keep anyone, it's Chris Paul because Carmelo Anthony will be available, and if you have Chris Paul and Carmelo Anthony in the LA market, you hope eventually to lure LeBron James. That would be
you
the
made
what
that
about if
point.
they got
Yes.
Paul
Oh, you
George?
made that point.
Yes.
I had nothing to do with that, huh?
Last
You
week.
made that
Last
point.
week.
Melo and CP3, huh?
Yes.
You go ahead,
First
Mac.
I made that
You
point,
thief.
but
You thief.
I also made the point you just made last week.
What about Paul George?
If you
I
want to
got
know
it.
Stephen
I
A's
got
point,
it.
just watch
I
me a
got
week
it.
later.
I got
He'll
it.
be, yes.
I got it.
Sorry.
I got it.
What
Hey,
about Paul
listen.
George?
That's what greatness does.
If you
steal
If
great
they
habits.
blew up the team, obviously.
If you can bring in Paul George to play with CP3
Wants to
and
be in LA.
DeAndre Jordan, sure, of course. If you could turn Blake into Paul George, yes. And I said also, if you could turn him into Carmelo as a lure for LeBron. And because Blake doesn't seem to work, it seems to be a bit redundant with Chris Paul.
All right, let's